Hello again, it's Joe Yudin, owner of Touring Israel, luxury private tours. You can't come to Israel at the moment, so I thought I'd bring a little bit of Israel to you. So today we have a tour guide that's been working with us for many years, and his name is Ari Melnik, and he has a passion, and his passion is wine, and he's going to talk a little bit about Israeli wines, past, present, and maybe even in the future. Hello, Ari Melnik. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. I have my wine. I have my X-Men in the back. Everything's good.
Terrific. So first, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself before we get going? You have that American accent. Where does that come from? Where did you grow up? What's your background? How did you get to be a tour guide? And where did the whole wine connoisseur passion come from?
Okay, so I grew up in Israel in a place called Hod Sharon, a town that grew oranges, and my mother came from the United States in 1972. One of her first memories was the Yom Kippur War, the sirens on the streets. And I grew up speaking English to her, so this is why I sound this way. But otherwise, 100% genuine Israeli. I used to be a teacher, a history teacher, and math for high school. And I was looking to make a transition. I like traveling, I like meeting people. And I became a tour guide about 15 years ago.
And how long have you been working for Touring Israel? It's been a while already.
I think it's been a big while. I think our first group together was 2009, actually.
Oh wow! So
Yeah.
we're talking about 10 years plus.
Yeah.
No?
It's soon a bar mitzvah.
Oh, that's right. No, I mean, you're one of our most popular guides, and we've never had one complain about you. Always very positive things, and we appreciate you working with us. So tell
Thank
us
you.
about wine. It's not one of my strong points. I'm not a big drinker. I know back in the 1990s when the winery business started to flourish here in Israel, Israel was kind of the Israeli wine market was kind of a joke. I remember a Friends episode where they were even making fun of Israeli wines back in the 90s. But the industry has really flourished, and some very fine wines come out of Israel. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, first of all, the history of winemaking in the land of Israel?
Absolutely. It shouldn't be surprising, really, because wine is mentioned in the Bible. It's actually mentioned 139 times. And not only that, it's one of the seven species of this land. So grapes grow very easily here. What people usually imagine about Israel before they arrive is a hot desert. But
Right.
this is, in fact, not the reality. 20, 30 minutes away from the coastline, which is where most of the population live, but actually a lot of the landscape is hilly and mountainous, and the climate is actually very, very good for wine. And this is why they've been making wine here since ancient times. And when we say ancient, I'm talking at least from the third millennia BC, including all the wine that was shipped over to Egypt. It was all made here. We were a part of that empire. They did not grow grapes in Egypt. Everything originated in Israel. So it has been a very, very ancient industry in this piece of land. And you can see this is a picture, you can see thousands of these all over Israel.
Right.
This is a wine press. It's a very simple machine back then. All you do is spill the grapes, step on them, hopefully with clean feet.
Right.
And then the wine comes pouring down. Some of the sediments of the residue of the wine would then stay in that pit. Everything else you would collect, you would put it in an amphora, you would let it sit there for a month, 2 months, 6 months, even a year, maybe for some wines more, and then you would filter it and drink it. This is how they used to make wine, and essentially, this hasn't changed much.
Right. So there's a couple of things you say in there. First, first of all, 3 millennia ago, so that would make it the Middle Bronze Age, the even
Absolutely.
Canaanite period. So we're talking
Correct.
about even before monotheism, before at the time of Abraham, um, ancient peoples, the beginning of civilizations. You also mentioned the seven species. So the seven species are the fruits and grains that are mentioned in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, grapes and olives being one of them. And then you said Egypt they couldn't grow grapes. Yeah, not only couldn't they grow grapes in Egypt, they couldn't grow olives in Egypt. And so these are two of the most important products in the ancient world, wine and olive oil, and the Egyptians couldn't grow it in their environment. So that's why Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was so important to Egypt. And that's why Egypt and Mesopotamia, whatever the empire in Mesopotamia was, whether it was the Assyrians or Babylonians or the Hittites or whomever, were constantly fighting over the land of Israel. One of the reasons anyway was for wine and for olive oil.
Of course. And actually, we don't need wine to live. But the interesting thing is, it's really one of the most ancient cultivated foods that we have. I mean, we did need wheat. If you wanted to live, you had to make bread. You don't have to have wine. But actually, right after they start making bread, wine is one of the first products made by human beings because wine is fun. It was this way thousands of years ago, and it still is. And this is why people love consuming it, not because they need it, but they want it. And it has become also embedded in the religious culture of the land, because, as you know, in Judaism, we have one special blessing for wine, but we only have three blessings for all foods. We have food that comes from the soil, we have food that comes from the trees, and then we have one unique blessing, which is mainly for wine, which just shows how fundamental it is. And every Jew would bless over the wine on Saturday. And of course, for Christians, you have the Eucharist, which is an emulation of the Last Supper, which is also a fundamental ceremony. So this is also embedded in the religious culture later on.
Right.
Now, what you're looking
also, we'll get back to that picture in a second. There it is. And is that also a Canaanite site, or is that Israelite?
Well, this is an Israelite site. This is from the time of King David. This is actually in the Elah Valley. It's called Khirbet Kayafa. And it's a very unique town that they found. It's 3,000 years old, and it's one layer. So everything they found there is from the time of King David. And in fact, they also found olive pits, which they carbon dated to the time of King David. And this overlooks the Elah Valley where David and Goliath had their battle, and where Israel's wine route actually goes through today. We too have a wine route in the Judean hills. This is the region. And it's great to combine a little bit of that ancient history where you can find people who lived 3,000 years ago, drank wine, made wine, and also go to wineries all over in the region. And in fact, when you look at this picture, it's somewhat surprising to people who'd expect Israel to be a desert. It's a very beautiful landscape. You could think maybe you're in Tuscany. That's exactly what it looks like there, especially now with the blooming season. We're in spring now. So it's just a great thing to combine while you're in Israel.
Right.
You can have a wine trip everywhere, but not a wine trip like this.
Many people, when they think of Israeli wines today in America and in Europe, they think about the Golan Heights, and that's because that's where the first one of the first major modern Israeli wineries that came onto the scene came from. But today, as you said, the Judean hills in and around Jerusalem, the place we just saw in the Elah Valley in the Judean lowlands, has really come in unto its own. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the modern wine scene, the different wineries, maybe what was the first modern winery in Israel? Where did it expand to? Where it's at now? I know now they're even growing wine grapes in the Negev desert using the ancient Nabatean ways, which Petra was the capital of the Nabatean Empire. So why don't we go over those? I know that's a lot.
It is a lot, but let's just go one step backwards.
Sure.
For 1,300 years, there was no wine production in Israel. Ever since Israel was conquered by the Muslims, and their wine is forbidden. So they shut down the wine presses, and there was no, let's say, mass production of wine in this country for 1,300 years. This changed when the first Jewish pioneers arrived in Israel in the 1880s. The first pioneers in the modern era, and they were looking for an industry. They were also looking for financial support. And they're one of the, let's call it the bastard cousins of the Rothschild family, a guy named James. This is the Rothschild branch that lived in France. And essentially, he established and supported the first modern wine industry in Israel. You see in the picture, this is Zichron Yaakov, established in 1883. These are the first modern 19th century vineyards they set in Israel. He sent over his specialists. They tried to make the wine.
From France.
I can't say French. Yeah, French varieties, by the way, from southern France. So you would
Mhm.
have wines like Grenache and Carignan, and these were absolutely terrible wines. But this was the first modern industry, really, in Israel for the pioneers, and it did support them for a while. And I will say that while back then this was a terrible industry as far as the quality of the wine, um, these are the oldest vines that we have in Israel today.
Mhm.
And the modern winemakers that use these grapes, thin them out, use modern technology, have been able to produce the most amazing wine from this. If you get a good Carignan from Zichron Yaakov, from a 19th century vineyard, that's amazing. Wineries like Somik. Barak is a winemaker of he's one of the descendants of the immigration from the 1880s from Romania. And he still has vines that date back to the 19th century. This is pretty amazing. So these would be the oldest vines in Israel, but not so numerous.
Right, and so would the first winery in the modern age in Israel be the Carmel, winery,
Correct.
which also
So this
in
was established in 1887, and this was the first big wine producer. It's still a very, very major wine producer in Israel. It's either number one or two today. And they still make wine, high quality wine, not like the kosher wines that we used to have. Um, this is an example of a winery from the mid 19th century as well, in Karem in Jerusalem. It's just a wine cellar that was used by the locals. Maybe they don't know until today. Could have been used by some of the monks living in one of the churches to produce wine for ceremonial purposes. And today it's a store. But it's incorporated into a jewelry store, and it's just a beautiful place, and it's a little piece of history. So
you
that's an
mentioned
example of one of the early sellers.
right. You mentioned that, that the Carmel wine, it's an excellent wine, not like the old kosher wines that we used to know, the Manischewitz of that, Americans
We've
know.
all had those.
Right. And there's Carmel wines are kosher. So people in America, there's a stigma. They think of Manischewitz when they think of the kosher wine, which is a ritual wine, and they stay away from it. They think that, oh, if it's kosher, it must be boiled. But that's not true. Why don't you tell us
Correct.
the different what makes a wine kosher?
Essentially, it's a complicated series of halachic laws that were developed over the years by the rabbis. But essentially, what this means is the pouring of the wine needs to be done by an observant Jew. That's why every kosher winery employs at least one observant Jew to work together on everything that's pouring. That means that the winemaker, once the wine is taken off, once the grapes are taken off the vines, will never touch the wine with pouring or transfer it. That needs to be done by an observant Jew. Otherwise, the production is completely identical. Therefore, there is no difference in taste. So you don't boil the wine, God forbid. It's just great wine. It's just that little difference in the
Right.
production.
So back in the day when Jews weren't allowed to own land and weren't allowed to farm in Europe, and they couldn't produce their own wine, they would take the Christians' wine and they would boil it, and that would
Correct.
make it kosher. So that's where that whole idea came from. Is that correct?
Correct, because Jews on mass production they did not do agriculture. Sure, they had a kitchen and a chicken in their house, but nothing major. They weren't allowed to. They were forbidden by the rabbis to do agriculture because, of course, once you do agriculture, that means it ties you down to the land. And when the time comes to get up and walk over to Zion, you wouldn't leave.
Right. And
So wine was
there
not
are also
produced by
laws
Jews.
against Jews owning land in some that throughout the time in European history as well.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
So that also comes from that culture. So kosher wine is good wine, have no mistake. Today it's produced just like any other wine. In the 1990s,
Mhm.
something happened here. The economy developed. People became more industrious, and I'll say innovative. And you already
Capitalism.
know this from the high tech version of Israel.
Mhm.
But wine is a high tech industry. And they
Right.
brought over a few specialists from University of California and Davis, and they toured around the Golan Heights, and they said, you know what, this lava rock this is going to be great for wine. They checked the elevation, they checked the humidity. They said, you know what? In 30 years, you're going to be producing the best wine in the world right here in the Golan Heights. And that was really the establishment of what I call the contemporary New World wines of Israel. And today, this is not only a mass producer of wine, they make over 1 million bottles. I think the number is somewhere around 1.5 million bottles. But today, they produce exceptional wine. I have an example here. This is a bottle from Golan Heights. Let's see. There we go.
Gamla.
This is their label. You see the ancient. There we go. The ancient oil lamp, just like you see in the picture. They produce exceptional wine, and the Israeli wine industry really evolved since they made the first big change. They started opening wines in every single region of Israel, and highly professional people decided this is the grape we're going to grow here, and at this elevation, and on this soil. And Israel is blessed with a diversity of soils. We have all sorts of sediment rocks. We have chalk stone. We have limestone. We have lava rock on the Golan Heights. We have sediment rock in the desert, which is different. And they started growing uniquely and highly specific varieties that fit the region. And then the big boom really came in 2003. You can go to the wine list with international ratings. A guy who any wine drinker knows, named Robert Parker, who established a magazine named The Wine Advocate, came over and tasted for the first time Israeli wines. And a wine that was produced in the Negev desert on a high mountain in the Yatir forest received for the first time international acclaim. A rating of 93 from Robert Parker, the #1 wine specialist on the planet. That was the big boom. Today, every year, wines are rated in Israel by Wine Enthusiast and Wine Spectator and the Wine Advocate, and you get a list which is getting longer and longer. Today, there are dozens of wines that come out in Israel every year with that 90 or over rating that is highly sought after by winemakers. And it's becoming a well-known, internationally acclaimed wine industry. And it's just a fascinating thing to travel through, and you wouldn't expect it from Israel. But yes, you can have excellent wine in Israel.
I see there are a couple of whites on that list. Israel wasn't known for its whites. It was said, back, 10 years ago, Israel can only make good red wines. Is that still true?
So here's what I'm going to call the transfer from bold to fine. Okay. Israeli wines in the beginning were known for being bold. That means the climate is hot, the sugar content in the grapes is high. That means that's going to produce a lot of alcohol. A lot of alcohol evaporates, and that means the wine is very in your face. You smell it. It's strong. It gives you, I would say, like a hammer on your head. Like a little blow on your head, very communicative, perhaps very Israeli in a way to describe wine that way. That was the beginning. And I think today what happened is the world has diversified and Israel has diversified, meaning there's been a transition to more finer, more introverted wines. And that's what happened with the white wine industry as well. So the white wine industry was bigger and bolder as well. A lot of oaky Chardonnays from California, that was the big thing. But today, the way they do it is lighter. And in Israel, they age, I would say, 80 or 90% of the white wine in stainless steel, which makes the wine lighter and less buttery. It's also more suited to the climate. And they do grow it in the highest regions. And it comes out amazing. So today we have, we even have a boutique winery that specializes in white wines at the Judean Hills, Sphera. Amazing. And people drink it. People who, serious drinkers that sometimes I guide from California who know wine, they come to the Judean Hills, which is sediment rock, very well suited for these white varieties. They drink the wine. They said, you know what? This is a really good wine. And this is something you couldn't hear maybe 20 or 30 years ago about the Israeli wine industry.
So that's terrific. Tell us a little bit about who went out into the Negev desert and started growing wine with using the ancient ways to do it, and knowing that it would be good. And where else in the world do they grow grapes for wine
It's
in the desert?
yeah. It's phenomenal. This is an Israeli idea. So we
Right.
do have some ancient wines that were grown in the Negev Desert, in the desert height, as you said before, the Nabatean culture. And today they have small, very unique wineries that are trying to emulate how the Nabateans grew the wines 1,800 years ago. And
Mhm.
this is the newest version of the Negev Desert wine. The internationally acclaimed version, like Yatir, which is grown also in the desert, is a private enterprise. It started off with a kibbutz and an investor. And the same wine guy has been there, Iran Goldwasser, for I think now it's 20 years. And he knows exactly how to grow it there. Great guy. I'll give you a great quote from him. He said, wine is spoiled grape juice. Everything else is philosophy. That's a great quote from one of the leading winemakers in Israel. Very down to earth guy. And I have to say that also every time you meet an Israeli winemaker, you find the most communicative, down to earth people, really great people to meet when possible, and they are accessible, worthwhile doing.
And one of my favorite things to do is to go go to the Nana winery down by Mitzpeh Ramon in the middle of the desert near the
Yeah.
Machtesh, the crater. And he has this beautiful yeah, kerem. How do you say an orchard?
A vineyard, yeah.
A vineyard.
Yeah, whatever, yeah.
Translating from the Israel, a vineyard in the middle of the desert, and we meet him there. And sometimes we will have a chef come, Chef Tal, and come and cook a meal for the people, and have this picnic in the middle of the desert, in the middle of his vineyard. And it's just a spectacular setting while they learn about how the Nabateans used to um, make wine and grow their grapes. And it's just really a very special setting. I think one of the biggest mistakes Israelis make is they always try to say, oh, the Galley, it's just like Tuscany. Oh, we have wine just like Tuscany. It may look like Tuscany, but Israel's not Tuscany, and we have
No.
our own very distinct pluses and unique characteristics in this country. And I think we should push those and not try to compare to other regions. So tell us, what are some of your favorite wines? What are some of your favorite restaurants, maybe in Tel Aviv, where you
Yeah.
can go, maybe
Mhm.
wine bars in Tel Aviv and around the country? Do you have any? Is that something you can talk to us
So
about?
look, every restaurant in Tel Aviv today, and we do have many big ones. Of course, we have to see what stays open after the Corona crisis. So I don't want to say too much. But they all work with the small boutique, high-end wineries. And actually, many of the wines that you can get in Israel, you can never get in a store. You could get in these restaurants. You know, places like Toto and Kitchen Market and Pronto. You can get phenomenal Israeli wines there. Here I have a very well-established, well-known Israeli winery called
So,
Castel. This is Granvin 2014, which I can't wait to drink. We
he has a
have
very interesting background, the winemaker at the Castel Winery, doesn't he?
sorry.
The winemaker at Castel, he has a very unique background. He was he came from Switzerland. He worked for the United Nations. He realized that in the Judean hills he could produce, that it was just like you said from the beginning, they were producing wine 5,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
And he liked to make wine, so he started growing grapes just for his friends, and his friends were so impressed with it. They told him, hey, you got to market this. And that's the whole story behind the Castel Winery. And I think the Castel Winery was the first real boutique winery that went that was a popular wine for people from abroad, wouldn't you say?
Correct. I would say Castel really appealed to the international audience. And the reason is Castel, unlike any other Israeli winery, is what I would call an old world winery. It goes after the French tradition. It evolves in the glass. It's not going to taste the same in the beginning of the meal and at the end of the meal once the bottle is opened. And it's very unique in that way. He produces phenomenal wine, of course, for many years consecutively. Very well known. This, for example, not far away from Castel. This is, hold on, I think you can see it now. This is Tzoa, another guy with an interesting story. He was a pilot in the IDF and then became a winemaker because this was his passion. And of course, you know, these guys do not become millionaires in Israel. You know, he produces 70, 80,000 bottles a year. These people who do it, they do it for the love of wine. So this wine producer used to be a pilot, Eran Peak, also the only, so far, master of wine in Israel. Any wine lover knows what that means. There are maybe 400 people in the world that are official wine masters. It's a very high prestigious degree. That means that you can identify where the wine comes from and the mixture of the grapes by sniffing it and smelling it and sipping it. And he's one of a kind, the only one in Israel. Soon we're going to have a second one coming up.
Who will that
maybe
be?
even a third one. Ido Levinson, phenomenal winemaker. He's at the final stages. He
And
still has a little work to do.
What's
He
the
needs to
name?
hand in a little thesis.
I see. Does he have a winery?
He has his own garage winery. He calls it Garage de Papa. And there he produces, you know, what he really, really loves. But he also works for a big industrial winery today and advises for many others.
I see.
It's a very small world in Israel. Everybody knows each other. You know.
How did you get so into it? I mean, you know much more the about this than most tour guides. Was there something that sparked your interest in it?
Ironically, it's my father-in-law, whom I met 20 years ago, and he was a big wine drinker, and he was a big wine drinker, and he got me hooked on it. And apparently, I had this classmate of mine who I mentioned before is going to be the next master of wine. I just knew from the town I grew up in. And yeah, I started drinking and learning about it and visiting wineries. Today, what I love doing is exploring new small boutique wineries. We do have a couple of these in the pictures. We have Peppa's Winery, which is a garage winery in a kibbutz, and a winery that I've visited recently in Bet El, which is in the West Bank. Phenomenal wine. He makes 10,000 bottles a year. And this is us sitting with Nina. She's the wife of the winemaker Hillel, with a couple of clients, and they make exceptional wine. He came from University Davis in California, and he made Aliyah to Israel. They produce wine. There's amazing archaeology to see in Bet El. So you can connect the two things. And this is what I love doing these days, exploring new wineries. And this is Peppo. He makes wine also in the Negev Desert. Beautiful wine. And, you know, they each have their own story, their own unique culture. And it's just a phenomenal way to know the country and feel it in a different way than what could be perceived as traditional.
Terrific. Well, I really appreciate it, Ari Melnik. We during this coronavirus, you know, we tour guides don't have much to do, so I'm trying to pick everyone's brain and getting a little info out there to all of our clients, past, present, and future. Hopefully, when they come back, any of you that are interested in wine, Ari's your man. We have some other tour guides who specialize in wine as well, but Ari's the man. And we look forward to you coming back to Israel. Ari, thank you very much. Jonathan Rose in the background, our tech guru and producer, and a Wendy Perrin top travel expert. He should pop up any minute now. There he is. Hello, Jono. Thanks for all your work in the background. and we'll see you all again very soon. Take care.